for coming and listening to my presentation. Um, my name is Dylan Winkler again, and today I'll be talking about immature gopher tortoises and their burrow site selection in restored Sandhill. So I kind of want to start broadly talking about the importance of fire. Fire-maintained ecosystems are spread out across the globe, and in the southeastern US here, we have upland pine forests. Some examples of these forests are longleaf pine savanna, Florida scrub, and sandhill community. In Archbold, we have a special type of sandhill. Fire provides a lot of benefits for plants and animals by clearing woody plants, opening the canopy, and promoting the growth of herbaceous plants. And one animal that benefits from fire is the gopher tortoise. So gopher tortoises are threatened terrestrial turtles that live on land in upland, well-drained habitats with loose soil that they can burrow in. They need herbaceous ground cover to eat and open patches to thermoregulate, which are all benefits of fire. They're very well-studied species, and there have been many papers on them, but relatively few papers on juvenile tortoises or immature. Might use those two words interchangeably. Immature tortoises have additional requirements to juveniles. Some studies have suggested they need additional cover because they're smaller and more vulnerable. And finally, gopher tortoises are a keystone species because they dig burrows. Hundreds of animals rely on and live in gopher tortoise burrows, and these are called commensals. So at Archbold, we see lots of snakes and frogs in burrows and lots of really cool insects and other invertebrates, including a few that are only found in gopher tortoise burrows. So for my project, I wanted to ask, where do immature gopher tortoises like to burrow? And I wanted to look at a small scale and a large scale. For the small or microhabitat scale directly around the burrow, I asked two questions. Does the density of vegetative cover affect the burrow microhabitat selection by immature gopher tortoises? And I thought that burrow sites would have an intermediate level of cover because gopher tortoises need open areas to bask, but they also need cover to hide from predators. And my second question was, does coarse woody ground cover affect burrow habitat selection? I thought that burrow sites would have more coarse woody cover, and I defined coarse woody cover as any sort of woody debris that was greater than the smallest tortoise that I measured, which is around 7 centimeters. And previous studies had found a correlation between young tortoises and burrowing under woody debris for additional protection. And then at my larger scale, the macro habitat, I wanted to ask about where tortoises choose their foraging area. So I asked, does the abundance and richness of forage plants affect burrow habitat selection by tortoises? I looked at the, I asked, I predicted that forage abundance and richness would be higher at burrow sites, so tortoises would have more food available. And then my final question was, does fire history affect burrow habitat selection? I thought that burrow sites will have been burned more recently and or more often because of fire's indirect benefits on the vegetation around their burrows. So for my project, my study site was at the Archbold Biological Station in South Central Florida, specifically on Red Hill, which is this dark red and light red section. It is a upland southern ridge sandhill community with a subtropical climate and has had a history of fire suppression for a long time until Archbold started a prescribed fire program in the 1980s. And since then, there have been many prescribed fires on Red Hill. And more recently, in 2013, there have been mechanical treatments and mowing to supplement fire and start restoring a lot of the sandhill community. So to begin choosing my points to survey, I wanted to choose a relatively even proportion of burrows and random points so that I could compare them. For my burrows, I chose burrows that I knew had been occupied by a juvenile tortoise sometime this summer or when I sampled the point. And I chose burrows within the juvenile size range here. For my random points, I wanted to get an even distribution of the 3 units that I surveyed. And I also looked at the fire history maps to make sure that my random points were distributed in an even representation of the fire history in these 3 units. I generated many random points in GIS and then chose ones that were at least 8 meters from a road edge and at least 16 meters from an active and occupied juvenile burrow. And then I began sampling the vegetation. So to sample at my points, I used 2 scales, the microhabitat and macrohabitat. For my microhabitat, I designated that as 1 meter around the burrow. And I measured that in 4 cardinal directions using this half-meter quadrat. I measured percent cover of bare ground and these other variables. And I can talk about each of them more later if there's time. And then for the macrohabitat scale, I measured that at a distance of 8 meters. And I chose 8 meters because previous studies had shown that juvenile tortoises forage at around an average of 8 meters from their burrow. I measured the plant species and abundance in 4 8-meter transects in the same cardinal directions from 0 to 0.3 meters off the ground. In addition to measuring vegetation directly, I also calculated the fire history of my points. Fire history can be calculated in a few ways. I used fire frequency, time since fire. So fire frequency is the number of fires in a given time period. So I chose the last 20 years from 2000 to 2019. And time since fire is a good representation of the recency of something, how recently it burned. I also calculated them individually in a couple different ways using fire intensities of the point. So I calculated both fire frequency and time since fire with intensity greater than 1, which means that the fire was at least a light fire. And I calculated both again with a fire intensity of at least 2. So there was at least a moderate fire at that point. And so I looked at my results. For my first question, my structure variables, I plotted the distribution of burrow and random points for 4 variables here. I didn't include debris because debris was highly correlated with bare ground and some of the other variables. And I also combined 2 layers of vertical cover and vertical short, and the 2 taller layers into vertical tall. And I saw that burrow points had a tight distribution of bare ground in the intermediate, which is what I was hoping to see. And the random points had a wider distribution, which I was hoping to see as well. In addition, vertical cover short also had a wide distribution of random points. So to test whether there was a difference between burrow and random points, I ran t-tests and saw that bare ground, there was significantly more bare ground at burrow points than at random. And my other habitat, or my other microhabitat variables did not differ significantly. So I wanted to explore bare ground a little more. And I looked at a former plant intern study from 2018 we found that adult burrows have the sand mound, or what's called the apron, in front of the burrow was proportionately larger the bigger the adult was. So they had more bare ground and less debris the bigger they got. So I wanted to see if that trend was driving my variable significance. So I omitted burrows with widths that were larger than 15 centimeters because the width of the burrow is about, or is correlated to the length of the tortoise. So I reran my statistics for bare ground and debris with burrows, with smaller burrows, and saw that they were still marginally significant, which might indicate that bare ground and conversely debris were a habitat predictor for when tortoises wanted to dig burrows. For my second question, coarse woody ground cover, I had relatively few points with coarse woody ground cover within a meter of the burrow. Burrow points and random points had around the same proportion of woody cover near them. And even though the woody cover near burrows had a higher mean volume, I estimated the volume of each debris, it was not significant. And most of my debris were slash pine logs, which were relatively rare in the ecosystem. So for my third question, I looked at my plant species. Sandhill has many plants, and I tried my best to identify as many as I could. I recorded 62 that were at least 2 points. I found 14 different introduced species and 4 state or federally threatened species. And then 50 of these were documented as forage or food plants for tortoises. So to see if there was a difference in the forage plants, I looked at species richness, which are the number of species of plants. There was around 20 to 30 species of plants at each point in the 4 8-meter transects. So I ran t-tests between all my species and just my forage, and I didn't see any significant difference between burrows and random points. And the same was true when I tried the abundance or the evenness of plant species. In this ordination plot, I have burrows in red and random points in green. And you can see their distribution based on forage species was almost overlapping totally, almost the same, and had a very low A score. So they were very similar and not different, not significantly different. I further tried to break out forage species into forb and graminoid abundance. So graminoids being grasses and sedges, and forbs being any other flowering herbaceous plant. And both of those abundances were similar between burrow and random. And then I also tried to look at wiregrass, because wiregrass is a important forage plant for tortoises, and also a dominant grass in sandhill communities. Wiregrass abundance, while high, was the same at both burrow and random points. So I finally wanted to try and look at all of my variables together and include fire history. So to do that, I looked at principal component analyses, or PCAs. PCAs can take many variables and compress them into a few factors that are easier to plot and interpret. And so I used a few of my cover variables, fire frequency 2, which I chose because of all my fire variables, it had the best explanatory power Time since fire didn't seem significant for any of my analyses. And then graminoid abundance and short vertical cover. So for both of these graphs, I use the same x-axis. It's what I call tall cover. Canopy cover and tall vertical cover. And then for this first graph, I plotted debris and bare ground. So high debris and low bare ground at the bottom, and low debris and high bare ground at the top. And if you look at the blue points, the burrows, you can see that most of the burrows clustered at the top of the graph, which shows that they have lower debris and higher bare ground, which supports my earlier results. In addition, while not quite significant, they do have a higher proportion of points in the center of the tall cover with less wide distribution than random points of the tall cover. And then for the second graph, I plotted tall cover against what I called my fire factor. And this factor combined high number of fires, high graminoid abundance, and high ground cover or high vertical cover that was short. But I didn't see a clear pattern in the burrow distribution here. It seemed almost the same as random. And both these graphs explained about 40% of the variance of my points. So finally, I wanted to see if I could plot any sort of relationship between vegetation and fire. And there have been past studies that have looked at this. So I plotted my fire frequency with intensity greater than 2 against my grass and sedge abundance. And I saw that with increasing number of fires, there was an increasing abundance of grasses and sedges. And this was also supported when I plotted all my species against fire frequency. So points that had only been burned once are this red polygon. And then with increasing number of fires, the polygons increase in size, showing a greater heterogeneity of these points, which support a greater number of plant species. So going back to my hypotheses, I believed that burrow sites would have an intermediate level of cover and would have more coarse woody cover near them for my microhabitat. And I did not see this with most of my variables except for bare ground. And I did not see that with coarse woody ground cover. And this could be for a number of reasons. It could be that juvenile tortoises are not choosing one specific cover type. And then it could also be that I combined a range of burrow sizes, which means a range of tortoise ages, whereas one of the studies I looked at that had a relationship of coarse woody ground cover, they only looked at hatchlings. And then for my forage plants and fire history, I thought that forage abundance and richness would be higher, and burrow sites would have burned more recently and more often. And I did not see that for either of those. So in conclusion, I want to say that immature gopher tortoises on Red Hill did have a higher preference for bare ground from what I measured. It could be that for the other variables, gopher tortoises were moving more than what I measured at a larger scale. They are mobile, and there have been studies to show that their home ranges are actually much greater than even their forage. Or it could be that the forage plants that were available to them were abundant enough throughout the 3 units that they didn't have to choose based on forage. And finally, my data do show that the Sandhill restoration efforts at Archbold are paying off in terms of positive effects on herbaceous plants, abundance, and richness. And with that, I want to say 100 thank yous to everyone that helped me on this project, especially Betsy and Mandy for everything from beginning to end. Thank you guys so much. For Viv for all the GIS help, and Lena for teaching me how to scope a burrow and measure a tortoise. Thank you to Archbold Biological Station for this internship, and all the interns and my family and friends. And thank you everyone for listening to my talk. And I can answer any questions.
Yay, thanks, Dylan. My start video was slow there to respond. We're out here, we were listening. I know you can't see us. Great job. Okay. Looks like there's one question. I was going to ask you one thing that I think maybe I know we talked about, but maybe you just didn't mention. Give time for some other questions to come in here. Why it seems counterintuitive that the small tortoises, if they're vulnerable to predators, would prefer more bare ground near the burrows. So do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. They could, well, because they're small, they do need less bare ground than if they're older. And bare ground, I might guess they would want for easy visibility. If they are worried about more predators, then they might want to be able to see more predators, or to be able to move easier in a landscape.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I wondered if they might want a quick, nothing blocking their access to the burrow, essentially.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Maybe, maybe, I don't know. This is speculation, but yeah, it's interesting. Okay, we had a couple questions. I'll read them to you. So Eric Menges is asking, on the graph that shows your, it's one of your last results slides, the grass and sedge abundance with number of fires. He was curious what actually was the measure on that y-axis, since it doesn't look like it's cover because the abundances were over 100. So you want to talk about that a little, clarify that y-axis.
Yeah, the abundance axis. Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were a count of the individual clumps of grasses and sedges. So for abundance along transects, I counted one plant as its own clump if it crossed the transect. So those abundances were the addition of all of the grasses and sedges along those 4 transects.
Yeah. Okay, here's one. Do tortoises ever use more than one burrow?
Oh, definitely, yes. And some previous studies have shown that juvenile tortoises use 3 to 4 burrows a year on average, I think. I'll have to double check that.
So how might that have affected things?
Well, they definitely have a larger access to forage if they use more burrows than just one. And being more mobile, then they could have less preference for the individual burrow site and more for their whole community of burrows.
Right. And one other question I'm seeing here, this might be tricky. Did you consider using the NM, the non-metric multidimensional scaling, to look at all the variables at the same time and in more than 2 dimensions? So I know that you and Mandy worked together on the NMDS ordination. So I don't know if that was something that y'all thought of doing or not.
I don't think we used them all at once. I think we tested them each individually. And we did make ordinations for all three fire variables, and for forage plants versus all plant species. And none of them were very significant except for the plots that plotted by unit. So I have a graph of that. It seemed like the individual units that I measured in had their own fire histories, and they also had different sizes and access to, or spatially different spatial differences in terms of road and edge effect. So that could have driven most of the difference in the 3 units.
Right. Yeah.
But it would be
So
interesting to try all of them as well.
That could be something we could play with.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm not seeing any more. Oh, okay. Wait, I do see that there was something that came in on the chat from Betsy Boughton. Do you think that the vegetation could have changed, after the burrow was put in place compared to what was there before the burrow? So sort of that idea of the temporal difference in timing of when you measured things versus when juvies were actually maybe picking a site to burrow in.
Definitely. Yeah. We thought about that and talked about it a little bit. Definitely for annual herbaceous plants, that was a consideration. But I tried to measure all of the points while a juvie was occupying the burrow. So while I was still choosing to live there. I would hope that if they are still occupying the burrow, then they are still selecting that site for whatever plants it had.
Great. Okay. All right. I think that